Hello again, everyone. This is Charles J. Bastrap welcoming you to the conclusion of the five-part series premiere miniseries event, Racism in America, here on #TheThing. And we have covered a lot of ground spanning several hours, and I am so thankful and humbled for you taking the time out to hear me speak. You have no idea what that means, and I really hope that this is doing something for you, that you're getting something out of this. Now, I've spoken a lot about racial injustice. A lot. About the follies and dangers of violent groups on the right and left, even ones that may be carrying simultaneously benign slogans. And in the last video, I spoke about what some things that ordinary citizens and celebrities alike can do in change in the way that they act towards things and one another. In this final part, I'm going to circle back to roles and responsibilities the media and politicians need to embrace if any of this has a chance to work, and how law enforcement and legal personnel can and must affect positive changes to retool the way our far too broken justice system works by providing better policies and procedures to finally put an end to unfair practices that disproportionately affect our Black and minority citizens. It has been a long road so far, so thank you for coming with me on this journey as we begin this last part. Though I've cited her a few times already, it's worth speaking once more about historian and journalist Anne Applebaum, whose Iron Curtain, frankly, should be mandatory reading for anyone interested in post-World War II Europe. In that work, she said, quote, "Before a nation can be rebuilt, its citizens need to understand how it was destroyed in the first place, how its institutions were undermined, how its language was twisted, how its people were manipulated. They need to hear the individual stories, not the generalizations about the masses. They need a better grasp of what motivated their predecessors, to see them as real people and not as black and white caricatures." End quote. Those are things I have echoed for many years, going back even before Crossroads was published back in 2010. It's easier to dehumanize the other because it makes it so that you don't have to be challenged in engaging them. But as we've seen, that's been at the root of so much of the rot that still exists in America that we must be rid of. There's no one magic solution to all this. That'd be great. It's easy to say racism should be abolished. It is much harder to do, even though we don't want that to be true, even though it shouldn't. It's hard because of just how much effort it takes on everyone, and because there are those who we just won't ever be able to reach, trying to hamstring us at every turn. There's a reason that these protests and riots and unrest are happening, and why they were able to get so out of hand at times. And it's because we've been really unwilling to truly have those difficult conversations with ourselves and one another, hoping it would just all get better on its own. But it didn't. It hasn't, because that's not the way it works. So we need to be truly better. And in previous entries, I've talked about speaking with one another versus talking at one another, and also trying to understand one another. But it can't just be the everyday people, given we lack so much of the power on the greater stage, or even just celebrities for that matter. So we do need to turn to our elected leaders and the press to speak truth to these concerns, to report fairly and accurately, to stand for our interests and not their own. Now, while we can't blame racism in and of itself on the media or on any one politician, despite what some may think, we do need to start holding them more accountable because, as we've seen, there have been far too many incidents that exploded because of the irresponsibility of either or both. Now, back in 2007, early 2007, I was still working at the White House, and President Bush had just authorized what became known as the Surge, to tamp down terror groups in post-Saddam Iraq. It was well overdue, and it resulted in a drastic drop in the loss of lives of both Americans and innocent Iraqis alike. But after a few months, I noticed something. The media coverage had been almost nonstop on troops killed, but as the numbers began to dwindle, they stopped reporting as much, sometimes not even reporting on Iraq at all on a given day. It was a bit kind of like how every day towards the beginning of this year, the news had a COVID-19 death headline until it plateaued for a while. Then it became about case numbers, and then deaths were brought up only for more milestone numbers, but otherwise beneath the fold. Now, I asked a guy with CNN, what's the deal? And he shrugged and said what I said earlier about another situation. Yeah, you know what they say. If it leads, it bleeds. And there was my answer. It wasn't sexy enough. The media had found a new toy to play with. Media right now is a lot different than it was many years back, even back in 2007. With the proliferation of social media, we see 8-year-old millionaires on YouTube channels being influencers, Anyone with a phone is suddenly an embedded journalist, and organizations are getting scooped by kids with GoPros. Now, the mainstream media, and I refer here to all of them, left and right leaning alike, are often unsure how to handle these things, and so they tend to have this desire to be first more than being right, and going to the stories that will garner the highest ratings or keep a certain message going or whatever else. Being first isn't always good. In the Olympics, sure, great, gold medal, gold star. But if you're the first to report on an incident and you were so intent on that you didn't fact check any of it, and then hit publish and it winds up being a false narrative, well, you need to be held accountable for any damages that may have come from that. And we don't see enough of that. We saw it a bit recently with that Nick Sandman kid, but that's mostly anomalous. There were so many in the media and so many fans of their chosen media as willing accomplices that were looking for particular focuses, looking for things to ignite the ratings base, and it becomes hard for them to resist that juicy morsel that's dangled right in front of them. The problem isn't always what they choose to report, but how they do it and when they're wrong about it. President Trump has made a big issue of the term fake news, and while yes, he tends to use it for everything that deigns to challenge him, it's actually, the truth is, he's been right more than a few times. In the aftermath of his election, there were dozens of reports of hate crimes that were being attributed directly to him, and they were instantly reported on as facts because that had been a major narrative thread throughout the entire campaign. But then more and more of them were turning out to be fake, from the Muslim girl in New York City who was never attacked on the train, to the black student in Wisconsin who left himself racist messages, to the black man burning churches in the South. That's not to say they weren't real ones, but we tend to remember those fake ones a lot because not only were they literally fake news, but because of the real problems that spun out of them. To say the media is biased is akin to saying the sun is hot. I don't care what network you're watching. CNN and NBC and the like have been going further and further left, making a strong case for the so-called Trump derangement syndrome to be entered into the DSM. And Fox was already right-wing, and now they're going even further down that rabbit hole. So the stories they're getting are becoming more and more aligned with the people that are not just the ones that are just skirting, but even crossing those fringe groups. They still have legit stories, don't get me wrong. But there's a way in which they choose and frame some that are blatant in their bias, and it endlessly shocks me that people deny that, on both sides. Now, I'm not going to harp on or reiterate what was already an entire section in Crossroads. I'll just post a link to that below for all to read on their own for free. I'm planning a video down the road on media bias, but I do want to return to a few cases we've already talked about to show how much more responsible reporting in certain stories instead of rushing to the press with no vetting or allowing clips of videos or out of context quotes to be the driving headline could have had a far more positive outcome. Now, a common critique of the media, and really this is one that I would love to see a huge study done on to determine how correct or incorrect it is that the media tends to use racial identifiers when it suits certain stories. I see it frequently in my area of Maryland. In the past year or so, there were two very controversial shootings by the police. Duncan Lemp was a white man who, as one version tells it, was victim of a no-knock warrant and killed sleeping in his bed. Or in another version, killed while sleeping in his bed as shots were fired from outside his house. Or in a third version, armed and refusing to comply and shot fully awake. Virtual no reports have mentioned the race of him or the police involved, and it's still ongoing and controversial. I only know of his race because of the picture that was here in the paper. Now, in another case, William Green was shot while handcuffed in a police cruiser by an officer named Michael Owens, Jr. Both were black. In the majority of the coverage in my area, if the race was mentioned, it was only of the victim. And again, I only know the race of the officer because he was eventually charged and his picture's there. It's pretty obvious. So now let's go back to Michael Brown. While the intentional editing of 911 calls and mislabeling of George Zimmerman helped add a more racial component to the Trayvon Martin wrongful murder and essentially gave birth to the Black Lives Matter movement, it was the reporting in the Michael Brown case that really threw fuel on the fire. And as we've already seen, the narrative the media put out was almost completely fictitious, and mounds of evidence support that. Evidence that to this day is still ignored, as even a recent issue of Time magazine paying tribute to black victims of police violence still listed his name on its cover. How do we combat things like that? Well, for one, the media needs to be consistent. If you want race to be an issue, put it there all the time. You can avoid the critiques and accusations of bias if you apply to a standard of consistency. Second, and more importantly, Have consequences and accountability more often for not fact-checking stories, especially ones where the wrong details can literally endanger lives. Look at how different the reports are on Breonna Taylor and Michael Brown from the actual events. Ask why. Why did they not wait to see if the facts were right before broadcasting, knowing full well the reactions? Why is no one being held to blame? Again, we can't lay all the blame on the media's doorstep, but honestly, I don't feel it's an unfair question to ask why some stories are pushed more than others. Why are people only hearing of Tony Olympus' case now due to its similarities to George Floyd, despite it being several years old? I understand the question of where the outrage was or is. But I also understand that that's how blacks have felt so many times when their concerns have been pushed to the back burner, and the actions to punish cops or even everyday suspects for murders of white Americans and dole out more fitting punishments has been so much faster than afforded to black victims. I suppose one of the real questions to ask here is how much in reporting is racism and how much is racial in terms of motivation. The two words are different. It's racist. It's a racist statement to say all blacks are criminals. It's a racial one to say that blacks have a higher incidence of lupus compared to whites. One implies a superiority-inferiority based on race. The other is just simply a statistical truism based on academic data with no component of blame or bias. Now, transposing that to the media, are they choosing to run or ignore a story about white or black men shot due to a racist view of either? Or are they doing it because they know that racial or race-related stories, regardless of whether racism actually played a factor or not, tend to sell better? Why do the online sites for CBS, ABC, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN, etc., all have stories posted about the black girl in Virginia who lied about her hair being cut by white classmates, but not the murder of white 6-year-old Cannon Hinnant at the hands of a black neighbor for days, if at all, and even then only in response to that very question being leveled at them? Sure, local affiliates covered both, and these stations, they mentioned it on the evening news broadcasts, but as much as 6 days after the fact, only CNN of those mentioned sites yielded a search result on their website. That might have changed since then. But what puts more butts in the seats, especially right now? The fact that I can name over a dozen black men killed by cops, right or wrong, is horrible. But the fact that more whites are shot in terms of raw numbers, and yet I can only name 2 of them, and it's because one was a few miles from me and the other one's been brought up recently more, because of his eerie verisimilitude to George Floyd, that should be something to give us pause. Now, blacks are not overstating racism. They're not imagining injustices and police abuse. But as tinfoil hat conspiratorial as it sounds, how much of the unrest at any given time is partly fueled by the media playing people against one another for ratings or to perpetuate an agenda depending on the outlet? You ever notice how these stories go in spates? Major event happens, then we hear every single story they can dig up related to it until something else comes along. Remember those hundreds of thousands in immigrant caravans? They were headlines every day for a bit, and then they just stopped. Did they stop coming? Or did the media stop caring? Or worse, did we stop caring because the media stopped caring? Because the media pivoted and left it as a season-ending cliffhanger and then canceled the show on us? I honestly don't know. But the tsetse fly attention span news cycle needs to be held to higher standards. When they get it wrong, they need to make a point of clearly apologizing and explaining what happens. No half apologies. Print publications often issue retractions, though sometimes they go unnoticed. Like when Newsweek erroneously reported that there was a flushing of a Quran in a coalition prison, only to admit it wasn't true weeks later, but in small print after all the damage was done. Television media especially needs to be held more accountable for these things. They should report on things. They should report on racial injustices. The media, when high-profile cases are decided, need to show the results in a more transparent manner as quickly as they can and with as much vigor as when they're reporting on what came before, so that we can look at the evidence once it's been allowed. Too many people treat court like public opinion is a real place. All right? Sometimes a person is found not guilty even though they're guilty and vice versa, but it's not always a racial thing. It's up to the lawyers to prove a case, and the jury can only decide on the evidence presented. And we on the outside aren't always privy to what they're seeing because we have a limited view of it. But it's not like that one Grisham movie where McConaughey gave this impassioned closing statement by telling the jury to imagine a little girl being brutalized and then saying to imagine she was white and got a murderer acquitted for a completely different case. He was trying to make a point that they shouldn't be treating the murder of a black girl different from a white one, to bring empathy to the father who engaged in premeditated murder of the guy who killed his daughter in the other case, but to show that it was an understandable reaction, but it wasn't a legal one. That's not how it works. The jury can't go off emotion and feeling, or they shouldn't. They have to go on the evidence in the case. So that entire ending completely flies in the face of the judicial system, and I think it's led to a lot of people to believe it's totally a thing. Getting the evidence published and publicized can go a long way at increasing trust and forcing courts to be held to a higher standard, since they'll be more in the spotlight. The media, and especially social media, does a lot to shape our opinions and influence our ways of thinking. So it's more important than ever before to make sure that they're held to a higher standard and held accountable, especially since in this nation we've seen in everyone that's allowed dictatorships to rise, one of the first steps has been to control and consolidate the media. When the media openly declares its allegiance for one party or another, whatever the outlet, that could raise some flags. Media outlets, to me, should never endorse a party or candidate. All right, that makes their coverage inherently suspect, especially when I'm reading a non-opinion piece and you can instantly tell your political leaning. That means you failed as an objective journalist. We're never going to eliminate bias in the news, not completely. If the Yankees beat the Red Sox, New York papers are going to tout the Yankees' superiority, and Boston papers are going to say they got lucky. They'll both, however, report the truth, that the Yankees won. And are objectively better. Sorry, Boston, that's what it is. But the point is that even if we can't eliminate the spin entirely, there's a difference between a spin and a fabrication. And the media has or should have a responsibility to vet their sources before reporting. Who cares if some YouTuber scoops you while you're doing it? Oh well, that shouldn't be the important thing. The truth should. And if they're wrong, they need to come out and own it, like I said. Every time one of these stories is proven false, that's another win for the deniers. Think about it that way. And they need to be willing to show everything, even if it's not what their fan base typically wants to see. There were reports from people on the ground in some protests after the Breonna Taylor verdict that some groups were trying to stop people and even reporters from videotaping anything but what made them and their cause look sympathetic. Now, how widespread that was is really impossible to know, but that it's happening at all shows that there are groups trying to control the narrative through the manipulation of media, because it's been proven to work. Fox News loves to show the violent parts of protests. They need to show the nonviolent parts as well, that are much more plentiful. They show the attacks that police are enduring daily, but shy away from footage when cops are guilty of excessive force in dealing with protest groups or in other cases. CNN, etc., of course, they do the opposite. They love to keep touting the mostly peaceful as an ever-present mantra and continue to deny things that are literally on camera. NBC showed proof in the immediate days of the demonstrations that there was very little evidence of outsider extremists, especially from the right, being involved in the violence, but it was virtually buried by the other outlets, and the contrary narrative kept getting pushed, while outlets like Fox seized on those reports. Of course, when extremists, particularly on the right, actually did start getting involved, the reporting for both spun in the opposite direction. In Soviet Poland, a young woman submitted an article to a local newspaper about a starving mother and child that she witnessed when she came into the capital, and it was rejected on the grounds that the paper would only publish what was beneficial to the state. Now it's 2020. We're seeing these media conglomerations and even web-based sites doing the exact same thing, only push what's best for the cause. If you're going to push things about police actions, show also the near constant state of attack they're often under and have shown restraint. If you're going to talk about how a group has violently burned a building down and threatened some diners, well then show the many more hundreds and thousands that are marching and chanting peacefully and engaging in sit-ins and calls for unity. You can't claim, either side, you can't claim that this isn't about politics, and then show only things considered acceptable to your political bases. And people, whoever's watching, I'm begging you, look at the whole story. Look at the reports from both sides to get a more complete picture and ask yourselves honestly, am I all right with this? Do I truly accept these wrongs because I perceive them as better wrongs than another? Is that where we are now? But of course, the media isn't the only aspect to address when talking about combating false information and doing what they can to stop making up cases to incite racial fighting. Politicians play a major role as well, and there is no secret that hypocrisy is rampant in politics. I mean, geez, just look At the Denial River, both sides have been paddling down since the passing of Justice Ginsburg, neither willing to admit they're full of crap. I mean, the body's not even cold, and some of them are already demanding a replacement with everything else going on. And then again, I've read the Constitution, and I assure you, at no point does it have a PS that says, "But none of this nonsense matters if someone makes a dying wish." But I mentioned the media first because we often have cases of those fake stories being picked up by like-minded politicians to rile up their voting blocs and then sharing and disseminating those stories, rarely apologizing if called out, choosing more often to just delete and deflect and pretend it didn't happen, like I related earlier about Congresswoman Slave. Now, as bad as things like that are, we can't have elected officials at any level of any party encouraging violence or refusing to condemn it. We can't. We've seen a lot of partisan sniping and comments that were way out of decorum and unprofessional the last few years on both sides. But insults to one another notwithstanding, it's another thing when their actions or words allow violence to appear justified and try to stop criticism of it. It's very easy to point to Portland and Chicago and Minneapolis and Seattle leadership, all Democrats, and make it one-sided. But the fact is that many Democrats did speak out against the violence. And some of them even warned Black Lives Matter to stay away from the violent factions lest it hurt the cause. It's true. The Democrats voted against a Republican-led bill that would condemn the looting and rioting while also acknowledging the issues of systemic racism. But it wasn't, as Fox and others reported on the right, because they were all for the looting. It was predominantly because they felt it was more of a symbolic bill that didn't go far enough on the solutions to combat the root issues of racism. But yeah, part of their reasoning was to make a show of support for their base. There's no doubt about that. But as we've seen, those on the left have tended to empathize with the protesters, while those on the right end have tended to focus on the violence. Of course, there's been crossover, but with the left generally, we've not only just seen empathy, we've seen deflections and denials and refusals to lay blame on anyone by name outside of a nebulous alt-right, and a lot of calls for calm coming only when it was becoming obvious that the hearts and minds war was losing ground, like when Don Lemon, who is not a politician, pleaded with Joe Biden, who is, to say something, citing that reason, not the actual destruction. With the right, there's this laser focus on the violence, and a likewise refusal to call out right-wing provocateurs. Both sides have had politicians share edited clips that weren't what they seemed. Both have been playing to their home crowds. Both have been trying to use one another's responses or lack of responses as political capital. I've said it several times, I do empathize with the protesters, not so much with the rioters. The situations like what happened with city blocks in Portland, Seattle, and Minneapolis, those all happened with all but written consent from the Democrats in charge. They were the ones demanding no one be punished. They were the ones refusing to uphold the laws. They were the ones allowing citizens to hold other citizens hostage in barricaded areas and make demands. They're still the ones laying the blame everywhere else and not realizing that this blind support for some of these groups is potentially laying the groundwork for a Scorpion and the Frog type situation. Because some of these elements will be your friends now, but that's because you're a means to an end. I have seen that play out throughout history. In the vacuum left behind when the Nazis vacated Paris in defeat, there was a lot of civil unrest, a lot of finger pointing. Frustrations over the 4-year occupation just exploded. People were, being accused of having been collaborators and confronted, publicly shamed, head shaved, arrested, beaten, tortured, even killed. But it wasn't by law enforcement. It was by citizen-led brigades, and quite frequently, honestly, by Marxist communist groups who had previously been victims of Nazi roundups once Hitler betrayed Stalin on the Eastern Front. And these groups sought rather openly to establish a communist power base, as we'd seen in the Eastern Bloc once the war was over, but it was a goal that was so well known that even French underground resistance icon and eventual president Charles de Gaulle cautioned against it, because he saw that anyone that was not towing the communist way of thinking became suspect, even if they hadn't been actually collaborators, reluctantly or voluntarily, and even if they had actively resisted the occupation. What mattered now in the aftermath was commitment to a new cause. In other words, even people that had months and weeks, even days earlier, marched shoulder to shoulder with them in solidarity against the Nazis, found themselves in the crosshairs when they wouldn't go as far as groups like FTP wanted. They were allies only so long as that commitment was absolute. More appropriately, the alliance was one-sided, wherein one side saw it as a true alliance, and the other, as I said already, as a means to an end. Now, I do not think, in any capacity, that Black Lives Matter is planning or in any position to lead a revolution to take over America. I do not think that. I don't think they're a terrorist organization. I've said that repeatedly. But I do fear lionizing individuals that may be committing violent acts to a point where they may gain political clout, even a political seat. Already, we have some newer members in Congress that display some behaviors and rhetoric in line with Marxism. And I suspect as we start getting some younger and younger candidates in there, that we're going to see that more and more, as well as more far right-wing leaning members, as both parties continue to court the fringe and leave those of us in the middle out in the cold. The same people complaining that the Republicans aren't being empathetic and unfairly judging all the protests are still many of the same ones who have yet to acknowledge big reasons why Clinton lost. It wasn't all about evil racists. It was a lot about the lack of empathy that many on the left showed towards people in flyover country that in some places they just took for granted that they'd get to vote for, based on past elections. There are lessons to be learned being missed here, badly, by both sides. Now, people can say I'm misstating the potential of power gains of radical elements of BLM or Antifa or Proud Boys or other alt-right leaning types gaining any traction or influencing policy, but aren't we actually seeing that already? Whenever these politicians refuse to call them out, whenever they defend violent actions by calling the other side every name in the book to shout them down and deflect, yes. I wrote about the dangers of Hamas and Crossroads and the folly of thinking that they were normalizing after participation in elections. I also warned of the dangers of labeling all who voted for them as supporters of terrorism, because while some definitely did, there were a lot that chose Hamas because they felt the PLO had turned their backs on them. And while Hamas wasn't perfect, they were winning their hearts and minds by providing jobs, education, etc. But Hamas in its charter is open about wanting to establish Sharia law. They feel that no law can be established except through Allah. And they're using democracy only as an attempt to get enough seats or a large enough coalition to overturn it, the same way the Nazi Party did in the 30s and up into German politics. So yes, is it unlikely here in America in the immediate future? Sure, I agree. But it's something to keep an eye on. Because if you're telling me silence is compliance and I must speak out on racism because if I don't, it's the same as encouraging it, well then, if you're not speaking out on violence, wherever it's coming from, then it's the same thing as encouraging it. Can't have it both ways. Now again, many Democrats have and continue to speak against it. Some more than others. Some with less enthusiasm other than to say, oh yeah, they did it. But many, especially in several of these cities, have had tepid results at best. And don't even get me started on how their very real and very valid COVID-19 concerns about crowds and social distancing suddenly vanished once the demonstration started, and questionable and contradictory studies to justify a lack of serious criticism popped up and were pushed and made things worse and more divisive with a very real disease that's become way politicized. That's going to come up in another video entirely, trust me. But that doesn't make the Republicans better in this. By and large, they won't acknowledge the root causes. They won't the root concerns of the black people in America. They continue to talk about that 3% of violence, which means they're literally ignoring 97%. Math. Worst of all, our Republican president hasn't shown any real empathy or any leadership. And while I understand the desire to tamp down the violence, with the National Guard, instead of leading with blame and bellicosity, try to lead with a more conciliatory tone. He wasn't perfect, but look at how President Obama spoke to the country in the wake of Freddie Gray, how measured he was. Obviously, this situation is much worse, but he hasn't attempted at all. He personally insults fellow politicians. His rallies, he's like a WWE wrestler on the mic, and his solutions have almost all been rooted in more force, missing the point of what they were marching about completely, excessive force by those in power. And it doesn't help when Democratic governors try to say that they have it all under control when clearly they don't, or try to say the blame is all his when clearly it's not. But he had a chance, in an election year of all times, to really step up with COVID-19 and with this, and he hasn't just dropped the ball, he's kicked it down the goddamn block into a sewer. And yeah, it's great that Biden and Harris finally got off their asses and said something more public about the violence and tried to strike a better tone, but they come off as phony. Our justice system is broken. We have 2 justice systems because of inequality. No shit. It's too bad neither of you have been in positions to effectuate change on those fronts for the last few decades as, I don't know, district attorney, senators, vice president for the only black president in U.S. history. You're totally helpless, totally powerless to help before now. So yeah, I really believe you with how many policies you've both endorsed and helped author over the years that have directly contributed to this broken system you now suddenly acknowledge. They're like these faux hero firefighters who light fires just to show up first to put them out, and they want credit for bringing some water to a fire that they helped start in the first place. You're not heroes, you're arsonists. We need better from our elected officials. Stop pandering to your base. Stop using people against one another and trying to shame people into voting for politicians based on their race or gender while you're actively talking about combating racism and stereotypes. Stop spreading information, deliberately or intentionally. Stop deflecting. Start actually governing. Or you know what? There's not going to be anything left for you to govern because it'll all be burned down while one side just screamed about it without offering solutions and the other just sat there and kept those woke eyes wide and refused to acknowledge that it was getting out of hand. It's often said the first step towards fixing a problem is admitting you have one in the first place. And it is high time that the legal system and law enforcement in America have admitted it. Houston, you have a problem, and it's a big one. And it's been allowed to fester and grow and continue for far too long. And this is the moment now. This is the time in the history of our nation, for the sake of our nation, for you to say what we've all been saying. Enough. No longer can we have racial inequality in any capacity within these borders. It's time to show that the states aren't united by basic geography, but by the people within them being truly unified. The justice system as a whole, and the police in specific, have taken a lot of criticism over the years, especially of late, and much of it is completely warranted. The recent wrongful killings of black Americans is a tragedy made more tragic by the fact that it's nothing new. While we as a country on all fronts have made great strides in the realm of race relations over the years, we're not where we should be. And the ongoing unrest and protests and even riots are emphatic reminders of that. Chants of Black Lives Mattering, calls for justice reform, demands for defunding the police, they've been ever more present since George Floyd was murdered on a Minnesota Monday. And the question remains, what are we going to do about it? In America, blacks, though free in words for over 100 years, they remain shackled to the sins of the land because of a refusal to acknowledge their struggles and a real lack of will to truly liberate them. When a black person is brought in for a criminal offense, they are more likely to be faced with higher bails, harsher penalties, and less opportunity for plea deals than their white counterparts. In fact, they're more likely to be brought in on offenses overall compared to the same. While the police, unfortunately, have no choice but to use lethal force at times, killing around 1,000 per year in a nation of over 300 million, there are far too many times where force is inappropriately used, and of those times, it tends to be more likely that blacks bear the burden of the highest end of those statistics. In a recent study by Northwestern University, researchers looked at some numbers pertaining to the victims of police killings, whether justified or not. They found that the common defense used by many people, including President Trump, that more white people numerically are shot than any other group is factually correct. But that can also largely be accounted for by their sheer dominance in terms of overall national demographics. Now think about the NBA for a second, as it currently is versus how it was in the early 1950s. I'd bet anything now that if you were to look at those most often called for fouls, in the latter example, they'd be white. In the former example, they'd be black. How do I know that? Well, because the league didn't welcome its first black player until 1950, whereas today blacks make up nearly 75% of the NBA. It's pretty much a statistical given. Whites accounted for about 52% of the people shot and made up about 63% of the population. Now, blacks accounted for about 32% of those shot and made up around 14%. That's a huge difference. Now, there's also a matter of massive disproportion of 99.95% of killings being of men compared to women on average, despite their respective demographic proportions. Another thing that needs to be looked at more carefully when discussing equity, but not today. For now, focus on the race and how blacks are more likely to die in these scenarios, whether due to more excessive force or a lack in priority in receiving potentially life-saving medical assistance. This is why white people really need to truly understand what black people are talking about and why they focus on what are, in raw numbers, fewer cases, because it's a stark disproportionality compared to the overall population. Let me put this in a basic, if even crude way. All right? Suppose you have a fruit basket with 30 apples and 10 oranges. Now, if I eat 10 of your apples, you might not even notice very much. But if I eat 10 of your oranges, suddenly you're going to be left wondering why all the oranges keep disappearing. At the risk of straining the metaphor, this is why whites need to stop with the apples to oranges comparisons of the number of people shot overall, like it's some sort of contest, because that completely misses the point, especially as the whites killed by cops, regardless of being justified or not, are far more often not due to racism and racial biases, and they are not subject to the same types of police actions with the same frequency. There's a difference between cops killing a person who happens to be white and cops killing a person because he's black. Now, the latter, contrary to what many people believe today, is honestly not always the case. But for far too long, it was virtually policy, particularly in areas of the countries where the KKK were the cops and the cops were the KKK. Now, in the case of subjects who are determined to have been unarmed, it becomes more unbalanced. But remember, in some armed cases, black and white, we had incidents like people wielding fake weapons made to look real, where people were being dragged by cars or reaching into out-of-sight compartments or inside pockets or waistbands after having been told not to. So it's not always easy to say unarmed without the context if you actually see the situation in real time. Recently, some civilian activists got the chance to take part in use of force training simulators, and they were shocked by not only how often they got it wrong, but how many times they didn't shoot in situations they previously thought for sure never warranted it, only to be killed in the simulation because, surprise, it's a lot harder being a cop than they thought. I know it's often portrayed as nothing but macho, power-hungry, donut-eating simpletons and racists. But the truth is, we come from all walks of life, and we all swear an oath, and the overwhelming majority of us uphold that oath. It's terribly patronizing when I hear someone say all cops are bad right in front of me because they damn well know how hard I worked and the principles for which I stood and still stand for. And then they see me and they're like, oh, well, like I'm a pet. Oh, but not you, sweetie, not you. We know you. You're one of the good ones. It's like a guy who claims he's not racist because he had one the black friend he talks to at the gym. Yeah, you know me, but you're implying that knowing me gives you insight into me as a person, but you don't know all of them. You only know of some of them. And like anything, we hear about the bad ones more than the good ones. You think about that. There's a lot of things in life. Just think for a second. There were 10 NASA shuttle missions from February 1985 to the end of January 86. How many not named Challenger can you name offhand? Why? Because we remember most the one that went tragically wrong. So we don't see the literally millions of interactions with the police that occur in a given year that go right. We see the approximately 0.0001% that don't. But just because that number is comparatively small, it's nothing to write off, and it doesn't mean there's nothing to address. I mentioned earlier, it's a hard job, and it's one with high rates of stress and suicide, as officers know that a mistake on their part, it's not the same as forgetting to pump an extra squirt into a latte or missing a key free throw late in the game. A life, even your own, can be at stake. I've lost more people I served with to suicide the past several years than I care to count. I've been asked several times if I feel the 6-month average training time is adequate for a cop, and I say yes, but it also depends. Training 6 months in one place is not the same as 6 months in another. So as we talk proposals and solutions, the first thing I'd really like to present is a call for a more unified training for police forces around the country. Portland police that were interviewed were asked why they couldn't more effectively control riots, besides the reasons we've discussed, compared to places like, New York City. And they said simply that they don't have the resources, the manpower, or the training to do so. I told a story earlier about being struck in the head with a bottle by a protester. I was literally trained to hold that line in a much more strident way than an average, for lack of a better word, department, because of the nature of my job and where I was stationed. If we want police to be better prepared to handle these types of situations, regardless of the reasons, we have to provide them with the proper training and equipment and conditioning. This is a major reason why defunding, which I'll be getting more to as we go, is such a flawed, though understandable proposal. Now, part of what made my training so effective is that it was 6 months, yeah, but then it continued. I had a test with my firearm every month, or I couldn't keep it. with long weapons every quarter. I was periodically sent to training for things like use of force or diversity seminars and stuff like that, and I lived it daily. When a person is working in a city where nothing happens for 10 years on the beat and suddenly there's 8,000 people screaming fuck the police and lighting fires, they're at a much larger disadvantage than my force would have been. Longer training is not as important as better training. Think about being in school, or back in school, I don't know how old you are. How many times you tried to study for a test? How many times did studying longer for endless hours actually benefit you more than studying better, smarter, and more efficiently? But by creating a more unified training protocol and consistent standard operating procedures, as well as making certain that cops are able to be routinely retrained and tested to make sure that they are still sharp and still mentally prepared to handle emergency situations, while also screening for those who are genuinely suffering from the more potentially destructive aspects of mental illness, which is still a very hard stigma to face in the profession, we can cut down a lot on the case of the jumpy cop who panic shoots, or is so focused on a single video he saw in training that he just sees himself as a hammer in a world full of nails, or those cops who are truly showing that they are reckless and unfit for duty. It'll also reinforce the use of force matrix and how to de-escalate situations better through more in-depth scenario-based training more frequently. I am so glad, because I don't want that on me, that I never had to fire my gun once while on the job. I did have to pull it a few times, but in each case, we were able to get the situation back down to a level in which lethal force was no longer the only option on the table. Contrary to the thoughts of many, most cops don't want to use their firearms, and in fact don't, and that's been proven by the data repeatedly. This also involves making sure that the thin blue line is a saying of a reasonable allegiance. Now, much as Terry Crews warned of Black Lives Mattering morphing into Black Lives being better, the thin blue line must never be used as an excuse to protect cops that are knowingly in violation of their oath or allow them to intimidate officers who would report them. Cops who are found to have committed a crime must be held accountable and not shielded, no matter the rank, and quickly. Law enforcement cannot be expected to have the public trust them if they can't even trust themselves. So stop using the thin blue line as a thick blue wall to cover for bad cops. They don't belong there, and you know that. As much as people may think otherwise, no one hates a bad cop more than a good one. They tarnish the badge, they disgrace the institution, and they dishonor the people and the oath they've sworn to protect and uphold. Period. But it's often hard for good cops to step forward because of the protection afforded to some and the threats of retaliation. Part of this also involves removing things as cool and innocently intended as they may look or have been, like the Marvel Comics Punisher logo from official police paraphernalia like some agencies have. Some departments, rather. Sure, it might look pretty badass, but think of the message that sends, given the Punisher just kills criminals with excessive force without trial and such. Yeah, it's a fictional character, but think for a second about the optics of that. Do you really want people, especially in communities that are already wary of you, to see you and the Punisher skull linked? Even more especially given the historical linkage between authority and skull emblems, from pirates to Nazi SS officers. Spoiler alert, no, you don't. Obviously, like anyone else, cops, even potentially bad ones, deserve a chance to fair judgment. People often complain when a cop gets put on administrative leave after a shooting, saying it isn't fair, they should just be fired automatically. But that's because they're operating under the a priori fallacy that every shooting is inherently and automatically illegal. If they fire someone, and it turns out they were innocent after all, as we saw with the cops in Ferguson, Lancaster, and D.C., they've opened themselves up to wrongful termination suits. That's why investigations need to be handled quickly and not take months and years for evidence to be held, like with the Tony Limpa case, and they need to be held to higher transparency levels. One of the reasons the numbers for people shot and the numbers killed and whatever else are often so contradictory is because there's no uniform way of recording the relevant data. Yet. Enter my proposal for a national database through the Department of Justice that would require yearly audits of every police precinct in the country, each of those likewise being required to properly and completely fill out information on every stop and arrest, and especially officer-involved shooting or killing. Now, it sounds like a lot of paperwork. I know a lot of cops don't want that, and I remember paperwork was a pain, but a lot of it was also terribly redundant and inefficient and useless. But by getting rid of the excess paperwork many departments have today and replacing them with new forms to better streamline the process, we can finally have accurate data on arrest numbers, traffic tickets, everyday stops, etc., and be able to have them sortable by any number of demographic categories, both for the suspects and the officer. Now, obviously, no names would be entered into any database that's subject to the public being able to access it at one point, but for the protection of all involved, that's there. But currently, our data is far too spotty to be reliable. That's why you'll see FBI databases and they'll say, like, no, reported. They make it a case to say these are the ones that were reported because there are ones that are either not reported or in some precincts, they're not really required to report everything with the same stringent guidelines that I'm proposing. More accurate data will give a more accurate representation of policing in America and make it easier to more readily identify areas where things are lacking and areas where things are working well, so that we can try and apply the efforts in the areas of the latter to the former. So if we're wondering if it's true what the Washington Post reported, that black cops are more likely to shoot black suspects than white cops are, and white cops are likewise more likely to shoot white suspects than black suspects, well, if we want to know exactly how many traffic stops were initiated by cops in Rockville, Maryland, and what the racial demographic was relative to the population, well, hey, this system can help find that out more easily. It would take some time, definitely a lot of effort, and I know many cops, again, would be resistant to put in what feels like a lot of extra work. But think about it. That extra work is a way to make certain the wheels of justice are rolling properly and provide more transparency and trust. This is an idea I'm actually currently floating to a local precinct by me, and I've proposed helping them create a small-scale version of this for just one district station shift, in which I'd assist and handle the data entry so that we can see what it would take to go bigger. And that leads to another thing I've long been a proponent of, community engagement. I don't know what it's like to be that young black guy on the traffic stop, worried if the cop pulling him over is the one he's been warned about his whole life. But I do know what it's like to be the cop on that traffic stop, wondering if this guy I pulled over is the one I've been warned about my whole career. Those sorts of mutual distrust, especially when the media largely focuses on the worst of us both, are detrimental to solid engagement in community policing. By providing more funding for programs in which the police and public can interact and talk with one another, address needs and concerns within the community, and see each other as human beings with the same desires to be treated as such, we can help encourage people to come forward after a crime. We can build a reciprocal trust, and we can better understand what we do within the greater framework of the community. This is far better than what some other cities or schools have done in refusing to work in such ways with the police or letting them talk to children in classes about their jobs at all. Policies which are ignorant, short-sighted, and insidious in their attempts to control the narrative by more easily making it so that there's no positive scene of law enforcement by the youth, so they can easily keep that boogeyman fear training going. Honestly, I'm tired of hearing my daughter have to defend me from classmates parroting all cops are racist mantra because her dad was a cop, or having my son, who at 6 wants to be a police canine officer, confused as to why he heard people on the news on TV when I had it on saying kids dressing as cops for Halloween are bad for society, and he's just playing pretend like, dude, what's going on? That stuff is extremely unhelpful and grossly detrimental. These things I've spoken of, they won't be easy. There'll be some pushback, but I feel it's worth pushing back against that. They need oversight, they need effort, they need a will to succeed, and they need money. This is where the defunding the police calls need to be addressed more, and I'm not even going to bother with the patently absurd abolish the police nonsense. Let them try taking a knee next time their house is robbed, that's on them. A common complaint about modern-day policing is its militarization. That is, the use of equipment and weaponry that's typically used by the military in overseas theaters and not with civilians on American streets. There are even talks that agencies were briefly considering experimental heat rays that give a sensation of burning without actually causing any real damage during the protests at the White House. Now, while on one hand, that's definitely a less lethal means and definitely less physically effective means of dealing with a crowd, especially when people are crying, no pun intended, about legally permissibly used tear gas. On the other hand, do we really want to roll out experimental weaponry on American citizens, or any citizens anywhere for that matter? So yeah, Batman gadgets probably shouldn't be in the utility belt of law enforcement, but cops can't be disarmed or left defenseless, not in a country that unfortunately has a high rate of gun crime, a conversation for another day. While I get the argument that maybe reallocating funds towards other things not related to law enforcement is a solution, it ignores that there are ways to keep the funding but spend it better. For example, towards the creation of systems and databases and community programs that I've already suggested. By trimming the things that aren't necessary to everyday policing, those vehicles or weaponry that are basically big toys with an in case of emergency break glass threshold that they'll rarely, if ever, actually reach. Funds can be better spent on these things I've mentioned, as well as the all-important dash and body cameras. Dashboard and body cams for all police cruisers and personnel should be mandatory. Full stop. That's it. This is as much for the protection of the citizens as it is for the officers. Without body cams, do we think that DC and Lancaster would have cooled down as quickly as they did? With body cams, do we think we'd have as many unanswered questions about Breonna Taylor as we do? Now, I've already talked about the dashboard camera video that I watched in training where the cop pulled over a woman who then went banana balls. In court, that entire video is a major piece of evidence, compared to if someone had happened to be filming with their camera only at the second stop and posted that out of context. Then it's the cop's word versus the World Wide Web. Now, after Michael Brown, body cams were in heavier usage in many jurisdictions, followed by a wave of videos being posted that had cops being falsely accused of mistreatment and racism and being exonerated by the cameras. To many, it appeared it was killing the narrative that cops were doing anything wrong, but that supposition failed to take into account how many cops weren't using them, and the higher focus some sites were putting on the exonerated cops and not on the ones who were actually proven to have been acting improperly by their own devices. But still, it was kind of funny when a member of a local government recently asked a cop to turn off his camera to try and get his way out of a ticket, or when the school bully's parents brought the NAACP into a principal's office and accused a cop of saying racist things towards her during that meeting, and he was bailed out by his camera. Now, I know a lot of cops bristle at the idea of wearing what they feel is a babysitter, and there are some citizens that fear it'll just be a surveillance tool. Look at how different several of these situations I literally just described could have been. A camera could be the difference between a killer walking or going away, whether that be a cop or a citizen. And to me, that's more than worth it. Removing the ambiguity of a lot of these situations, preventing these riots, these protests, these whatevers. Funnily, it wasn't long after the proliferation of cops being exonerated videos started making waves before the ACLU chapters, some of them, suddenly stopped wanting them. They were saying, we don't want these body cameras as much anymore. They're potentially providing the police with an unfair disadvantage when it came to trials, because by having access to their own footage, they'd be able to have a better recall of the event in question and possibly be able to notice something that they honestly missed the first time around. And truthfully, I do understand that. I mean, suppose a cop shoots a guy because he says he had a weapon, and it just so happens he was right. But he never actually saw the weapon, he kind of just assumed. By rewatching the footage, he may be able to spot it and then act like he'd always seen it and be able to point to it. So the solution? Body cam worn during the officer-involved shooting or death gets submitted to evidence and can't be reviewed by anybody except by a legal team for trial. Simple. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when you wanted it in the first place. Finally, there needs to be an addressing at local, state, and national level of the unfairness that's been shown to Black Americans. All of these solutions, they're valuable tools. But like any tools, they're only as good or as bad as those who wield them. And so it's important for law enforcement to adequately admit the shortcomings of the justice system and show true commitment to equity in enforcing the law. They can start with things as simple as establishing bail standards or doing away with mandatory minimum sentences. So many of our prisons are de facto recruiting facilities for gangs and that are less about rehabilitation and more about mass incarceration and frequently radicalized prisoners, especially young Black men. Have more programs within the system for teaching trades and skills to nonviolent offenders. California learned how important their prisoners' fire brigade was during the recent wildfires when they were unavailable to assist because of COVID-19. So that when they are released, they haven't found that the world has passed them by and that they have nothing to fall back on but crime. On the other side, people need to stop glorifying prison like it's a rite of passage and good for your street cred. Hip-hop and rap stars here need to do their parts in the roles they play in teaching youth especially that that snitching is bad and that you're not really Black unless you've had certain experiences like this. The point is that when Blacks are unfairly imprisoned and then put into a toxic situation, and left with no options upon release, it perpetuates a cycle, and it's time for that to end, It's been past time for that to end. It's a cycle that sadly often spills into the next generation, as so many children grow up without a mother or father figure, especially a father figure, in their lives. And despite the hard work of the single parent left behind, they can't be everywhere on their own, or often provide enough, especially when dealing with racism or sexism or both of their own. The main reason I'm trying to organize some sort of toy drive for parents in these situations to help out during holidays and birthdays for children of those incarcerated, so that they can get a little extra joy and see that there's something good in this world. We can also help by decriminalizing marijuana. I don't smoke. I never have. But I don't see how it's any different than alcohol. I've seen a lot more accidents caused by, someone drinking too much and getting into a car accident. And anytime I've seen someone smoke too much, they go to Doritos. Big difference. Legalize it, tax it, whatever. Enforce laws on it just like alcohol. No driving with it, no in-public consumption except where noted, etc. Bottom line is, as blacks are more likely to be arrested for simple marijuana charges than whites, many are going into the prison system for things that they really shouldn't be. So why keep enforcing it? Think about how many people, black, white, or other, but especially black, have started their, quote, criminal careers over a few ounces of weed. Is that really worth hurting someone's future and setting them on these paths? Is that worth going on a record that may make it harder to get employment? One year, on New Year's Eve, I pulled a young black man over on 17th Street for running a light and blocking an intersection. He very honestly told me almost immediately that he didn't have his license on him because he left his wallet at his girlfriend's house in Virginia and he was on his way to get it from her at work. In D.C., no license for some reason is supposed to be an automatic lockup. It's an arrest. Now, I disagree strongly, and even though I swore an oath to uphold the law, I also swore to myself to carry out my duties more judiciously. I was not going to potentially ruin this kid's future over forgetting his wallet. I ran his name through the system per our standard operating procedures. He had no priors. He was just a 19-year-old kid who made a simple mistake. But I couldn't let him drive, because if he'd been involved in an incident after that and found with no license, that comes back to me. So I had him call his girlfriend. She was working in a restaurant in Arlington, Virginia. He explained. She had some choice words for him. And ultimately, she drove to our location by the White House and gave him the wallet. I had to detain him at the scene in his car with no cuffs the whole time, but he was appreciative that I didn't just arrest him and have him spend his holiday in jail. And he and I had a good talk about stuff like this, and he thanked me for giving him hope. See, those are the stories you won't hear in the media. But if we make that the norm, that won't really matter, because there would be no need to be talking about us at all, good or bad. The stuff that I'm talking about is a hard sell for a lot of people, especially now with cops hyper-defensive and citizens seemingly out of patience now for blood. And these programs, even if implemented, will take some time to bear fruit, though will ultimately be more effective than taking a knee or using a Sharpie on a helmet or changing a profile pic. In the meantime, police and citizens everywhere need to take a good hard look around and ask, is this the world we want to live in, to raise our children in? I know the answers to those questions, but I also know we have a responsibility to try and to be better. That means listening to and learning from one another. That means stopping this all white people are out to get me, all blacks are paranoid babies nonsense. That means calling out hate-filled, I'm only afraid when I'm near white people type Twitter twits, and racist, don't let the blacks pretend they're real people, they're just out to take over our country pages on Reddit, and the violent kill-all cops pages all over Facebook that somehow never violate community standards. Like anyone else, I want you to see me, not other people who might share aesthetic or racial characteristics with me, just me, because this is all I am. I'm not the past. I'm not any of my ancestors who were even here until the 1910s and 1920s, because I'm me. This is who I am. If we're rightly not going to punish children of illegal immigrants brought here unbeknownst to them as infants 4 years ago, I'm damn sure not going to be punished for what people did before me 400 years ago. And I want to see you. I want to see you, not as a criminal, not as less than my equal. not as someone who bears accountability for wrongs others have done that may share aesthetic or racial characteristics with you, whether it be street crimes or participation in the other half of the equation of the business of slave trading, because you're you. This is who you are. And when we start seeing people as people they actually are, rather than as people we think or believe or want them to be for whatever reasons, only then can steps towards progress be made. Because I shouldn't have to spend my life constantly apologizing, guilty by association for some historical original sin. And you shouldn't have to spend yours constantly having to work twice as hard to be recognized and heard and acknowledged, having to worry any time the police go near you if you'll be the next body on TV. We don't have to see eye to eye to stand shoulder to shoulder against racism. We just have to want to. And with that, the season premiere miniseries event on #TheThing, Racism in America, has come to a close. I thank you so much for your support and patience and attention through all this. I really do hope you watched it all, and I know it's not easy to hear things you disagree with, but I hope that you thought about them some more. Remember, this isn't about agreeing with me. It's about trying to see some things in new ways and better understanding different viewpoints, a major hurdle in understanding one another. This wasn't easy to do. It was a labor of love, countless hours in the making. But it's because I truly believe these words. I do. And I believe in these paths forward that I've presented. To all the people who've stood by me through the hate mail and good times alike, to my family who's put up with me working until 3 a.m. for weeks and letting me record these at stupid o'clock in the morning because it's the only time 2 remote learning kids and a work from home wife are asleep and quiet, thank you too. And I honestly almost didn't even do this, because I saw the time I was putting into it and found myself wondering what the point was, if it would even be watched or paid attention to, or make any difference at all. For over a decade, I have pushed hard for communication and cooperation across partisan and racial lines alike. And in my community, I've offered up ideas to promote greater unity through our shared diversity. And like an American at the Crossroads, my words have largely been ignored. And I wish I could distill things down to a few memes to make it easier to digest instead of these hour-long videos. I wish even half the people who claim the country needs more moderate voices like mine would tune in instead of tuning me out. And I wish I could make things fancier for those who do watch. I said from the start there are no bells and whistles, and it's because I literally don't own any editing software. These videos are done in one continuous take, and I'd love to be able to edit or add pictures and graphs or whatever, but that's just not in the budget right now. So this is literally me, raw and unfiltered, trying to maybe reach some people and make them think, trying to just do what I do and lay it all out there while I still have some time here on this planet. Future episodes for quite some time will not be miniseries events. I cannot undertake this sort of event again anytime soon. The emotional, mental, and even physical tolls this one took on me were a lot. So next time the commitment won't be as deep on your part either. To those few watching, I do thank you again. Thank you for listening, and thank you for giving me the hope that maybe one day so will others, even if I'm not around to see it. This mini-series is now done, but other single and shorter episodes of #TheThing are in the works, percolating in my brain. So make sure you subscribe, and you'll see when they come. I'll update periodically with some news too. I know I'm imperfect. I'm definitely not always right. And I'm sorry if at times I come off as robotic or almost cold, or at other times a bit more maudlin. People like me, we don't always do well with human connections. There's a lot going on up here at any given time, so it's tough to talk like this without going off in a million tangents. So I really do appreciate your watching and support and all that good stuff. I'm honored that you've allowed me this opportunity to reach you, and hopefully you got something positive from it. Hopefully you got many positive things from it. And I hope to see you all again during future episodes of #TheThing. That again will be much shorter. So please do hit subscribe. And in the immortal words of 2 famed philosophers, be excellent to each other. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you around. This has been Charles J. Bastrap on #TheThing. Stay safe.